it was always about, even when people would come up to us and talk to us on the street and stuff, or we'd be at the pub and, someone would start up a conversation with us and maybe they were fans of the show. To me, it was always just being fans of the games and being fans of the show, which was always a team effort. Like in my head, I don't have any fans of me. And at the time it was the same. Like, I don't think anyone's like watching it for old Junglist, and that's cool. That's how I want
I
it to
did.
be.
I was watching it for Junglist. You were my favorite host. And I'm not just saying that because I'm talking to you now. Really, really. Hi, everyone, and welcome to One Story Building, where stories are all around us all the time. Today's guest is reviewer, gamer, and someone with an internet nom de plume that I will haphazardly cram into the center of his name, as is tradition. It's Jeremy Junglist Ray. Jeremy Junglist Ray, welcome to One Story Building.
Thanks. So nice to be here. You say it just how my mom used to say it when I was a kid and I was in trouble. She used to say, Jeremy Junglist Ray.
Really? Is that where the name came from?
No, not really. It came from my passion for drum and bass music, for which, jungle is both a subgenre and also a predecessor. It's very odd in that regard that jungle gave birth to drum and bass, but now it's considered a subgenre of drum and bass. And so anyone who likes jungle music is a junglist, and that's where that comes from.
It's jungle, like jungle monkeys and trees in the jungle?
It's funny, the very first jungle tune that I heard was they were attempting to make jungle with jungle sounds, but I didn't realize at the time that wasn't normal. So they were trying to do, like monkey sounds and crickets and, I don't know, whatever else. But it's really just kind of like a fast-paced reggae with lots of snare drums at about 174 beats per minute, similar to drum and bass.
174.
So electronic dance music, yeah.
Right. Well, I have to say this is quite a nostalgic treat for me, because I was just starting high school in 2006 when Good Game was first brought to the world. Now, you were more than just a host of the show. You co-created it and submitted it. So as an example, what was it like submitting that pilot to ABC and then getting it accepted?
It was thrilling. It was simultaneously thrilling and surprisingly chill for what you would expect that might be. And that's because it happened in this little pocket of time, which is very unusual, where like ABC had this subdivision called ABC Online. And ABC Online had bought the rights to ABC2. And so all of a sudden, they had this new television network that they didn't know what to do with. And so they literally had people walking down the halls asking if anyone had any ideas for shows. And that type of thing just does not happen. It's very unusual. So, my friend at the time, Janet, was in one of those halls where they were walking down. And she came home one day and she said, they're looking for show ideas and stuff. We should make a gaming show. So being ABC Online, they were more tech savvy folks there. They kind of got it when we proposed a gaming show. There was an executive there who had previously worked at Nintendo. So it was a little bit of an easier pitch. We just kind of put together a one-pager of like what we think the format should be, all the segments that we think it should have, the tone that it should have, and stuff like that. And the original vision for it was quite different to what went to air. I think what went to air was definitely better. But the original vision for it was just kind of like a really small production where it was just kind of like me as a researcher and an incredibly small team. And because we couldn't really get anyone to jump in front of camera and be a host, we couldn't pay them. That was the only reason that I did it originally. And then that just kind of stuck. Yeah, I mean, we at the time, I think I was unemployed. I was playing a lot of Counter-Strike and a lot of WoW. This is a period of my life when I had a #1 Counter-Strike team in Australia, and I think right around this stage, I was just about sick of it. Like I was just like we had gotten to the #1 spot on the 2 ladders that existed in Australia at the time. And it was so much work that myself and my team had kind of already said, like, all right, look, let's make this last run for the #1 slot. And then after we get there, let's quit because we're exhausted and this is tiring. So that's the kind of stage that I was at right as the proposal was being submitted. But yeah, they accepted the proposal. They said that they didn't have much money, so they offered us about $800 to make a pilot. And we, most of that $800 went to my rent because I was a bit behind. And then we called in a bunch of favors for people to help work on the pilot. And yeah, so it was like surprisingly chill process for like you just wouldn't be able to do that now or anywhere else. Weird pocket of time where the stars aligned and we were able to do that, but also, yeah, quite thrilling, quite a special opportunity.
Even with all of my research, I assumed that you were an actor who was a gamer who wanted to be on screen performing, not you were the best person for the job, regardless of everything else that was going on. But now that I think about it, it makes all the sense in the world, because at least early on, and at least for you, it did feel like a show. I mean, they say this, and it was true. It was a show for gamers by gamers. Or at least for you, I really could tell early on that you were an actual gamer that actually cared about this kind of stuff. But speaking of performing and acting while on the show, I went back and watched a couple Good Game episodes, and nostalgia right in the heart for my nostalgia. You were co-hosting with Michael Kapowski, Mike Wazowski,
Yeah.
and he on the pilot episode, I believe you were reviewing Saints Row, and Michael, Mr. Mikowski, was introducing Saints Row, and he said, "Today we're going to talk about a game called Saints Row," and he went Saints Row like that. And when I saw that, I thought, he was told to say it like that. That wasn't him wanting to do that.
No, that was him.
Really?
That was totally him. Yeah.
Really? So like because I assumed that the director was like, all right, try and be all like gangster when you say it, okay? Action, go.
No.
But that was him wanting to do that?
You're right in that producers always do that. And especially like in other shows that I've worked on and other ABC producers as well, they really do try to get you to ham it up. And they like color and movement, so they'll be like, okay, that's nice, but could you say it with a bit more energy? Could you jump around? Could you do it in a wacky way? And sometimes that's more welcome than others. Like I've worked on some shows where they're trying to get a setup where they're trying to get a really nice shot, but they might do something like put two monitors next to each other when the people are playing StarCraft against each other. And then that's a time when I would normally jump in and say like, hey, people don't play like that because you can see where their units are on the other screen. And, it's the type of thing that the audience will, jump on the forums about and go, they don't really play StarCraft because blah, blah, blah. But in the case of Kapowski, yeah, no, I don't think anyone ever had to ask him to ham it up because he naturally did that like every time first take.
How did he get on the show? Did you know him beforehand?
Yeah. Sorry, excuse me. Yeah, we knew each other beforehand. We were doing sales at Optus, actually. We were in the sales division, inbound calls, selling like home phone, internet packages, cable TV, stuff like that. That's where I first met him. So we became friends there, and we were, going out, having fun nights out in the city. And anyone who's ever worked in a sales office knows that there's a lot of characters in a sales office. So we had a big group of friends there. And like I said, back with the original vision of the show, again, the original vision only had one host as well. It was kind of going to be like just one person delivering stuff to camera. And it was Mike who suggested, we were having a beer one day, and Janet was there, and Mike just suggested like it should be a two-person show because then you can bounce ideas off each other. You can play devil's advocate if you need to for a review. You can have one person take one point of view and one person take the opposing point of view, and you could smash it out, have a little mini good-hearted debate. And he was totally right about that. He was totally suggesting it out of self-interest because he wanted to be the second person on the show. But he was also completely right. So yeah, that's how that came about.
So you say that sometimes people can be devil's advocate and sometimes there can be a bit of a healthy debate. So how much of your opinions of the games on the show were your actual opinions, or how much of it was adjusted slightly to have some tension between the hosts?
Yeah, I think when there was like a review where, say, for example, there were two, if you think there are two particularly prominent views on something that the game did that's worth talking about, that would be a good time to have one reviewer take one view and one take the other view. So that's a tool that we used quite often. I mean, they were all our opinions in that we wrote the reviews ourselves. Sorry. But one reviewer would typically take charge of one game. So it would be very rare that both reviewers would play the game. Usually one reviewer would walk away with one game and then the other reviewer would walk away with the other game. And we would write the opposing person's point of view. And so if we had like two reviews in an episode, like, I would be the person that wrote like Saints Row and he would be the person who wrote the other one. And then we would read it before filming. And, like if anyone had written lines for me that I objected to, I would voice that and say like, like, I see what you're trying to do here, but, I just don't want that coming out of my mouth, like oftentimes, like, I would be happy to take like a devil's advocate point of view just to get the point across. And so would the other hosts that I would work with normally. But sometimes you just don't want something coming out of your mouth because it just doesn't fit you, right? Like, like if something was, like I would be like, oh, look, a Counter-Strike player wouldn't say that. So I would do that. But yeah, it's a tricky one because it's like they were all our own real opinions in that the hosts wrote the reviews, but they were scripted and you would write the opposing view of the other reviewer. And sometimes that's agreeing with you. And sometimes it's just more educational and informative and entertaining if they're disagreeing with you. Yeah.
I tell you, it's so heartening to me to hear that you and Michael were friends and weren't just actors that needed a gig, because it really did feel like two dudes in the basement talking about games. And maybe that was the intention, but that was the feel that I got. And it was a great show.
Yeah,
when
we're
I
still
was
friends.
Oh, great. What's Kapowski up to now?
He's living in Perth these days. He's rebuilding his life. Actually, he's rebuilding a house. His house burned down a little while ago, which is very unfortunate. I don't know if there was a podcast that came out a little while ago. It was talking about Good Game, and it was just after that. Geez, I can't for the life of me remember. I think it was like Gameplay Podcast. It might have been called Gameplay Podcast. Right after that, his house burned down. So jumped on Twitter and said, hey, he started like a GoFundMe or one of those things where you can donate, and he lost a lot in that fire. Insurance took care of some of it. But yeah, so he's got a new house now. He's rebuilding his life. He's got some kids. He's got some dogs. He's got a lovely wife. He's been flogging computer products and internet services again. Back when we were in sales at Optus, both Kapowski and I had more money than we knew what to do with. I think that's still the most money I've ever made in my life. Just commission from sales. So he's back doing that, and I'm sure he's probably doing a lot better financially than when we were a Good Game, because that was the thing. Like we gave up that to I had left Optus earlier than that, but he was still at Optus, and then he was kind of giving up that to work for basically nothing at the ABC. I mean, he was on like a small part-time wage as like the co-host, but it was basically nothing compared to what he was used to. So yeah,
really, that's kind of surprising. I thought that you and him would have been paid top dollar to be on the telly, anything to be on the telly.
Not really. We, eventually in like season 3, 4, and 5, it got to a better stage where it was like semi-respectable amount of money to earn, but it's not rolling in it by any means. Yeah.
All right. Well, in my further re-watching of Good Game episodes, I got to your review of Call of Duty 4. And I remember like 15 plus years ago watching that review on the telly when people had televisions, and you finished your Call of Duty 4 review by saying, and I've got it right here, I do remember it, but I did write it down just in case, I'm whacking a 10 on this bad boy, bam. And the thing is, I remember you saying that, even though I only saw that episode when I was, like 13, 14, I remember you saying that line for all the years afterwards. Like a couple of times, whenever I saw something cool, I just went, I'm whacking a 10 on that bad boy, bam. And
that's great.
Like it stuck with me until I saw it for a second time. And you said it exactly in the same way that I remember it, the same kind of cadence. So this is just sort of a question. Screw the audience. This is about me to you. How does it feel to be such a key part of so many people's nostalgia? Because I've worked with people that watched the show and were into it as much as me, and we used to say quotes back to each other, talk about the reviews that were done. How does it feel to be such a key element in people's lives and nostalgia?
It's a really interesting question. It actually still surprises me to hear a story like that. I remember that review. I was very comfortable with that 10. Because it was a jaw-dropping game. But for me, I guess it was really important for me for the focus to never be about me, and the focus, like, it was for me, it was always about the games, and never about the hosts. And I guess that's mainly because that's the type of show that I like to watch, where a lot of people try to do personality-driven content, and for some it works, and for some it doesn't. And for me, it was like I never really backed myself to sell it based on personality. It was just always about game analysis for me. And if personality ekes in there, then that's the icing on the cake. So it's always surprising to hear that is the case. But yeah, I don't know. I don't even know how to process it. It's like, it's, I guess it's cool. I mean, I don't, yeah. For me, that I don't know, my brain doesn't, like, it's like a jigsaw puzzle where that piece just doesn't fit in. Like acknowledging, like the story that you just told me, like it's really cool and I'm glad. But that puzzle piece just doesn't fit into the jigsaw where it's like, hey, you influenced people in this way. Yeah, I don't know. It's never really stuck. It's never really clicked that that's the case. I guess I've just always been so focused on the process and the products, like the games that we were talking about. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
I've now that I am of a certain age, when I remember things that happened about 10 or 15 years ago, it doesn't feel like the memories of me. They feel like the memories of a different person. But maybe that's just me personally. But I'm sure since it's been, well, I mean, Good game came out so long ago now that I'm sure when you think back, it's like, oh yeah, that happened. Yeah, it's just such an ethereal thing. Although it is surprising that you remember the things that I'm referencing.
I remember that review, yeah, because I remember there was a moment at E3 when they showed the first clips of Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare, and everyone's jaw in the audience was just on the floor. That game was so groundbreaking and amazing, and so I was really excited about it. And when we finally got to review it, oh yeah, that's right. I remember I went to Activision's office in Epping and played it start to finish, 7 hours. They were actually worried about, I think the PR guy was actually worried about what I was going to say about it. And like, journalistically, it's like you don't really tell the PR person what you're going to give a game or what you're going to say about a game before the review comes out. But I was like, dude, you don't have to worry. Like, the game's freaking amazing. But yeah, no, I remember that totally. But yeah, I guess in that time, like, it was always about, even when people would come up to us and talk to us on the street and stuff, or would be at the pub and, someone would start up a conversation with us and maybe they were fans of the show. To me, it was always just being fans of the games and being being fans of the show, which was always a team effort. Like in my head, I don't have any fans of me. And at the time it was the same. Like, I don't think anyone's like watching it for old Junglists, and that's cool. That's how I want
I
it to be.
did. I was watching it for Junglist. You were my favorite host, and I'm not just saying that because I'm talking to you now. Really, really, because
I appreciate it.
You did come off as like an actual. I mean, I love all the hosts. They're all equally great in their own ways, but especially from the start, you and Kapowski, it really was like two actual gamers, not actors who coincidentally like games, but two actual gamers talking about games to gaming people. So it was such a perfect fit.
Yeah, and you know, it's a funny thing with that, because you have to like in the beginning, like I had done some stage stuff before and some improv stuff before, but like you know, I was very nervous in the early period, and that's something that you just have to work through. But at the same time, it's like, you know, a lot of people know one game well and one genre well, and that was the case with me as well. Like, you know, I had to broaden my horizons when it came to game coverage and being a proper reviewer and critic, because in those early days, like I knew RTS really well, and I knew FPS really well. Some games, especially like obviously Counter-Strike, obviously Age of. But yeah, you have to, you just, you know, if you're going to be a week in, week out critic, you have to know every genre. So that was an effort. Like, you know, I had to get to an acceptable bar when it came to talking about racing games and MMO games and turn-based tactic games. And, you know, there were genres that I had never played before. And it probably shows in the early reviews. But I also think that, you know, being able to play at a high level, like at an esport level, it does also open up a door to a certain kind of criticism that isn't normally there. I'm not saying every critic has to do it. I think like every opinion is valid. Pretty much every perspective is valid. But it gives you another tool in the toolbox when you're like back in those Counter-Strike days, when you're analyzing a game at a level of like, you know, timing how long it takes for me to get to this line of sight versus the opposing team, and thinking about like, what's the counterplay? Like, they get to this line of sight a second before I do. So how do I have a flash around this corner that'll give me the advantage? And like really getting down into the nitty gritty of each micro sort of interaction of someone coming around the corner and all that counterplay. Like that definitely benefited me in every FPS, but also every game that I reviewed after that point. Because I think like you can review a game in a way that's like quantifiable and objective when it comes to design. Like a lot of reviewers like to talk about story and characters and stuff like that, and that's all fine. But I think that's one aspect that a lot of reviewers miss out on, is like there are some things that are objectively good design, especially in multiplayer games when it comes to like balance and things like that. And there are things that you can point to and quantify when you're reviewing a game. And if the game doesn't like meet those conditions and that criteria, it gives you really solid ground to criticize it on.
And then after all those years of criticizing, in 2009, season 5, episode 37, you were kicked off the show. Not what I initially thought for years and years, that you found a better job. You moved on to greener pastures, which is what I thought for years and years. I was like, good for him, good on Junglist. I'll miss him, but good for him. Now, we don't really have to talk about this, because what I do here isn't really about exposing controversial things, despite what the last half of episode 10 would have you believe. But do you mind telling us like your time with Good Game and how things changed over the years before you left for whatever reason?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess it's more accurate to say I was just axed.
Sure,
but
okay.
That's fine. Yeah, and I don't mind talking about it. It was a great time. It was a great 3 years. The last I guess 6 months especially was more stressful than the periods before it. And it was mainly down to a new executive producer that we had. We had worked with several different executive producers before, I think 3 before her. But new executive producer came on called Kath Earl. and she had different ideas about how to run the show. And she liked to play some silly power games with the people on the show. And up until that point, we had been kind of like a really family office. Like we had been quite tight knit, and we didn't have a lot of politics and a lot of silly power games and stuff like that. But she had just come on from Triple J TV, if I remember correctly, and that show had been canceled, or a little later it was canceled. And I think she felt a little bit insecure about her place in not being a gamer, not understanding the scene, and people constantly telling her like it needs to be this way because we understand the gaming scene and this is what they like. And so she started like doing this thing where she was leaning on people and trying to get them to admit fault and throw other people under the bus, which is, I don't know, I see it as quite a manipulative tactic. And she would do that to one person, and they would throw the next person in line under the bus, and then she would move on to that person, and they would throw the next person in line under the bus, and then she'd move on to that person. And it was a little game she was playing so that she could have something on everyone, like have some dirt, have some sort of fault on everyone. I don't think that she liked that I didn't want to play that game. At the time, I just kind of like let the buck stop with me, and I didn't throw anyone else under the bus. And I also didn't accept that, you know, when someone said that, hey, Jeremy was doing this wrong, because I was doing phenomenal freaking work on that show. I was like, definitely the two people who were working hardest on that show were Jenna and myself. And so, you know, there were like 3 a.m. nights, there were 5 a.m. nights. There were nights when I would sleep on the couch in the editing room. So no one can fault the work ethic and also the results. So I just wasn't accepting it when she would, you know, bring people into a room and try to get them to be submissive. So I don't think she liked that. And, you know, when thinking about how to restructure the show, I was the natural fit for her to get rid of. And she did very much have this idea that a show needs to be one male and one female. And she also had ideas around like who needs to be the goofy one and who needs to be the straight man. And she wanted us to try that out with myself and Badjo at first. Like she wanted me to be the straight man and him be the constantly goofy one. I was open to trying it. I tried to remain diplomatic throughout the whole process, and try new things and be willing to be the silly one and be the stupid one myself. And, you know, if you go back to the early episodes of Good Game, I was definitely willing to be like very silly and stuff. But I think what she really had in her head was, it needs to be one guy, one girl. And the guy needs to be the straight man. The girl needs to be the straight man. The guy needs to be the silly one, the goofy one. So that's what she was targeting. And they were auditioning someone while we were filming. And it was kind of a stressful time because I was aware that was happening. But there's just not much you can do about it. Like, you know, if the EP wants you gone, I was on a contract basis, and I don't think she really cared what the community thought. I don't think she really cared about the fact that she was getting rid of a founder, you know, someone who had like helped structure the show and built it and was, you know, right in there with the community every single week, like day in, day out. I was on the forums and in the IRC channel and doing all that kind of stuff. I just don't think she cared about any of that. You know, she was like, you know, sometimes when a new EP comes into a show, they just change the opening titles and the music and stuff like that. And that's their version of like putting a stamp on it. Like, this is my EP stamp. Her version of it was getting rid of me. So, you know, it was a painful time. But it also paved the way for the next show that I did, which was a whole lot of fun. Like the next show I made for Telstra on Game Arena, the website. I did that for 3 years. So it was 3 years of Good Game and then 3 years at 5-inch Floppy. And that the 5-inch Floppy show allowed me to go very in depth with every review that I did. I just focused on that one game every single week. And that was great for me. It was a whole lot of fun. Got to make the content that I wanted to make. Eventually beat Good Game at the at the video awards, which was also a lot of fun, given my two-man team beating like a team of like 30 or something, with all the resources of the ABC and their costume departments and all that. But I think the reason I really enjoyed 5-inch Floppy was we hadn't been able to go really in depth in each individual game at Good Game for like the last 6 to 12 months that I was there. Like in that period of time that we had the new executive producer, she had it in her head that she was going to streamline the process and the workflow. And to her, that meant one review a day. So the playing of the game, the recording of the footage, the writing of the review, getting everything ready for filming in one day. And that's, you know, depending on what game you're talking about, like that might be more possible with some games than others. Like if you're reviewing Tetris, then I think you've pretty much got it covered within a few hours, right? If you're doing an MMO, then that's going to be less possible. And she didn't really know the difference between those two things. So, and she didn't really care about the difference. So there was actually a situation where I was doing 2 MMOs within 2 days, which is just ridiculous. And like, you know, no reviewer should be doing that in good conscience. So it's eventually one of the things that I talked about publicly, but at 5-inch Floppy, I could kind of set my own pace there, and I could choose the types of games that I targeted. And I had the freedom to kind of go, look, I might be doing this little puzzle game one week, which is, you know, that'll only take me like a couple of days to properly review it and record all the footage. And that'll give me a full 2 weeks ahead of time to do this other game, which is massive, and it's just going to take more time. So I had the freedom to kind of, you know, shift things around there to make sure everything got its proper time.
That efficiency that was being put forward to Good Game really shows in the later years of the show, when Mass Effect 3 was given a 10 out of 10. And I was like, they didn't get to the ending because they didn't play it long enough.
Yeah, wow, that ending, hey. RGB, like
yeah. Pick your favorite. Like, okay. God, okay. I love the series, but that ending, it's like the problem isn't that there was only 3 choices. It's that nothing that you did before changes the choices. It's just there's all this story and stuff behind you, and then it just narrows down to one point and then prongs off into three.
Absolutely.
3 bits.
It's like a tree with a bunch of branches that eventually come back to the single point.
Exactly. Yeah.
And then, you know, you got to give yourself somewhere to go on the scale at a 10. Like I don't think a 10 needs to be a perfect game, but I think it's clear that Mass Effect 3 is not a 10. That said, you know, look, we've all made mistakes. I've certainly made mistakes, but I think like Mass Effect 2 is pretty close to a perfect game. And yeah, 3, yeah, if you had finished it, it's a rough one to justify, you know. Like I have a weird take on, like, you know, I do think every perspective is valid, and I think if someone is giving a 10 in good faith, then and if they can back it up with their justification, I think they probably, like, within the broad range of like review and criticism of a particular game, like there's X amount of reviews of Mass Effect 3 out there, right? And so within the broad range, like that 10 out of 10 probably represents the perspective of a certain percentage of people, right? Like there's, out of the chunk of people who will play Mass Effect 3, a certain percentage will think it's a 10 out of 10, and they're not wrong. You know, that's just their view on it. So I think, like, in the broad spectrum of games criticism, I think it all tends to balance out. You know, it's like I see people giving 6 out of 10s to games that are like clearly like 9s, or vice versa. And, you know, these people get a lot of attention on Metacritic because they pop out of the norm. You know, it's like, what? They gave it a 6 when everyone else gave it this, or you know, the other way around. But you know, I think in the broad range of criticism, it's yeah. Well, I don't get too worried about it. I think it represents some people's point of view, and other reviews will represent other people's point of view.
Well, what I think we can all objectively agree on is that Pokemon Ruby did not have too much water.
I wouldn't be able to tell you. I've never played a Pokemon.
What? None of
I
them.
know, it's crazy.
Okay. Well, I've never played a Final Fantasy.
Yeah, wow.
Take that, FF
Yeah.
fans.
There's some, everyone's got their blind spots. There's way too many games these days.
Mm.
Um, I've spent way too many hours in that game to it's probably sucked up some of the
Mm.
time that I would have spent in other games. But yeah.
I'd like to get to that later. Now you have written for fandom.com, gizmodo.com, kotaku.com. In your experience, what is it like writing text about video games compared to making videos about video games?
Um, yeah, I guess it allows you to be more verbose. It allows for greater prose, which is fun because there's sometimes you might want to include some, like, say for example, if you were writing a script for a video review, you might you might have a great play on words or write some great prose that just doesn't fit because humans don't talk like that. And some people have a style of delivery that can work with. The way they deliver it comes across. Even if it does sound like they're reading it, it can be okay because that's their style. Is they write like Shakespeare or whatever. But most of the time, you have to write differently for presenting to video than you would if you're just like writing for a magazine or a website or something like that. So it's a different kind of art, and it's a different kind of fun to have. Like, it's a different set of tools that you can use, so you can play around with crazy alliteration more, and you can, like, phonetics operates differently when you're talking as opposed to like when you're writing. So yeah, I enjoyed it quite a bit. I think even between the different written mediums, there's a different style. Like, the magazines, word count is the most important thing. And even between different editors, actually, because like, you'll have websites where you have an editor where, they'll care about formatting in images. And then, I had another editor who cared about going over the word count. Like if he said a word count of 2000, he wanted you to do 2,300. That to him was over delivering. And then I had another editor who was like, going under the word count is important, because so if he gives you a word count of 2000, you better give him 1900. Everyone's different, and it's a different ball game every day when you're like freelancing one day for Game Informer, and then the next day you're doing some stuff for Kotaku. And I must have written for just about every Aussie website at some point. And Game Informer had a really long-standing period where I was writing for Game Informer under Chris Stead and Dave Milner. They were really good editors. I think that's another thing that it's not specific to text writing, but there's like a back and forth that you can have with your editor that I think is really special. And I've found it very fulfilling. Like when you have a good editor for text and you really, really care about the written word and communicating your ideas in a concise but effective way, it makes you a better writer. It always results in a better product. And as a creative relationship, it's very fulfilling. So, I had that with both Chris Stead and Dave Milner over at Game Informer, two really good editors. And the Aussie version of Game Informer was a great mag. It was really sad to see it go. And then finally at Fandom, I got to be that for other people. So I was managing editor at Fandom, and we had other writers there, and we had a lot of freelancers. Some of the large portion of the freelancers I dealt with were Aussies, and some were overseas. So we had some younger writers and some more experienced, and I was trying to put together a diverse bunch. And that was also just as rewarding, like being that kind of like that editor for other people, and doing that mentorship process, very creatively fulfilling. Still very much enjoy it. Yeah.
How do you build up the prestige as a games writer to be picked up by all these game writing companies?
I guess for me, obviously post good game, name recognition was a factor. And then over time, that was less and less of a factor, which is, I also got gigs for just presenting stuff to camera here and there. And, it might be for whatever company like Dell or someone. And those were more frequent in the beginning, in the days just after good game. And then, they started dropping off over time. So I guess you could use that as a metric for like how much name recognition slowed down over time and stopped mattering. But luckily the offers for, writing and criticism and stuff like that did not slow down. So I take that as evidence that my criticism is genuinely valuable, and it's not just name recognition. And in terms of the criticism, I think, I've always tried to focus on some of the stuff that I mentioned before, like quantifiable and objective criticism of games, focusing on the gameplay and the art and science of fun, where I think a lot of reviewers should do that, but don't. Not every reviewer needs to do it. It's just that there's already a lot of reviewers who focus on story and character. Like that niche is covered. So, if a critic within the game space wants to stand out and, they want to learn about, things like extrinsic versus intrinsic reward and reward schedules and the different, like, get down into the nitty gritty of the science of like a jump, like something so simple as a jump. There's actually some complicated mathematics to making that feel good. And part of this means jumping into video game editors and testing it out for yourself, and learning a little bit about the process and learning a little bit about the language that game developers use. But I think it's a wide open space. Like, even to this day, like someone could really carve out a space for themselves if they review games in that way, just because so many people aren't doing it. But I think people respond to it, like people, everyone who plays games, if someone is writing in that way, they'll read the review and know what they're talking about. Like if someone's talking about game feel and they're talking about like, if they can contextualize, there's something called like the MDA framework, like mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics. If they can talk about like concepts like that within the context of a piece of games criticism and use it for like an argument of why, something is brilliant or why it's falling short, or even why it's just like excessively mediocre. I think that's something that I did, and that's something that resonated. And it's, even though I'm doing it, like it's still such a wide open space, like so many people could do that. So I think that's probably, if I were to say, like, if there was a key to it, like if there was a trick or something, like that would be it. Like I study game design, and I talk about that as a priority over the other aspects. Like I still talk about art, I still talk about story, I still talk about all this, but I prioritize design and I prioritize dynamics. Within the mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics, so many people focus on aesthetics. Lots of people use the word mechanics, but they're not really talking about mechanics, because mechanics are very low level, interoperating with the machine kind of stuff. I talk about dynamics a lot, and that's the kind of like counterplay and Yomi and like mind games and game balance and stuff like that. That's all of that stuff lives within the dynamic space. So yeah, that would be, I just naturally, that's what I'm interested in. So, it's not like I formulated that as a strategy. I'm going to take the gaming review world by storm by focusing on this and zigging where everyone else is zagging. It's just what I'm interested in. I think it, it plays into that whole Counter-Strike thing of like, really, really intensely analyzing every interaction between players, because that is a dynamic. Like that's the definition of a dynamic. Like I come around the corner 1 second before you do. What are you going to do to get yourself the advantage? Like all of that is a dynamic. So hopefully that answers.
Yeah. And speaking of the dynamics between players, you have said and you have stated that you have been very involved in the competitive gaming scene in Australia. Now, since we are post going to your friend's house and playing Mario Party 1 on their Nintendo 64, what is the Australian gaming competitive community like nowadays?
It's so interesting, isn't it? It's like, so many things, like the broadband has changed the landscape of it. And global competition has also changed the landscape of it. Now esports is a bit more like normal sports, where like if someone's a really good Counter-Strike player, they're going to go overseas. We're going to lose them. As soon as they get to a certain stage, we lose them. And that's the nature of it. Just like football, just like, so many other things. So it's heartbreaking, but it's also, you want to see him do well. Like, there's a guy, Chris Nong Dexter, who's playing for Mouse Sports at the moment. They're Germany based Counter-Strike team. And, he used to be a part of a Counter-Strike team in Australia, and it was sad to see him go. That's the most recent one that happened. And fate would have it that his old team in an upcoming competition, I forget which competition it was, but his old team came up against his new team, and he was the in-game leader of the new team, and he had to go up against them. And it's like, it's a shame because it was a major competition, and it really would have been great to see what it would have been like to have this Aussie team at full strength taking on the world. But like a couple of weeks before the competition started, they poached him. And this was a team, the Australian team had been dominating the local scene for like 2 years in a row. So it really would have been great to see, like, what is this Aussie team, the Renegades, and who were like just dominating locally, and what would have been like if they took on the world at full strength. So that's the kind of state of it at the moment. When I started in the esports space, the most you could hope to win at a LAN party was like a CPU fan or like a stick of RAM, or if you're really lucky and the hardware manufacturer who sponsored the event was really shelling out, then maybe you could get a video card. But that's like, that was it. You'd lug your computer with your CRT monitor into a hole with about 200, 300 other gamers. In Sydney, it was Sydney Gamers League and MPU and other places, and in Melbourne and other cities, it was different. But I have very fond memories of Sydney Gamers League with everyone lugging their computer together. And here's another thing about that time, everyone was playing the same games. Now you've got like so many games available to you that you've got like, you can pick the one that is so crafted for your personal taste, that we've almost, even though we have easy access to our friends online, a lot of us don't play with friends anymore because we've got this game that was just so hyper tailored to us that we, and your friend has something that's like slightly different. And so you're playing two separate games. Whereas back then it's like everyone, you were playing StarCraft, or you were playing Counter-Strike, or you were playing like one of the other few popular games that were around. So I missed that as well. Like, everyone just playing the same game. And it was a lot more communal. I made some great friends out of that time in a way that we just don't do right now. So that's kind of sad. But on the other hand, esports has grown leaps and bounds, and that's great. So
yeah, building community and making friends through games is one of the main things that people bring up when they bring up the benefits of playing games. But even then, when someone who isn't a gamer asks someone who plays games, what are the benefits of playing games? It always comes off to me as damage control. That's like, oh, well, you can make friends, you increase your logical thinking. And to me, it seems like they want to play games because they're fun, and then they add these sort of health benefits after the fact, after they want to play the games. So from your perspective, from your years and years of playing games, what are the benefits of someone playing games?
Yeah, I guess, well, to your point, and it depends on what kind of game we're talking about as well, because I do differentiate. I mean, there's several different kinds of fun. And Fun itself is such a troublesome word because, you know, we can be talking about a type of fun that is purely extrinsic reward and a Skinner box style of fun where it's just reward systems that are scheduled out semi-randomly, and it gives you the compulsion to play. And then you've got the more joyous fun that, like, you know, a Nintendo Mario game might employ, where the act of playing the game is the reward for playing the game. And then you've got, you know, games that have a specific purpose. You have the category of serious games. You have games that educate and persuade and train, and even heal. So, you know, the obvious, you know, to your point, the obvious answer is that they're fun, and that, like, you know, this is my entertainment style of choice. Like, you know, instead of only watching Netflix or only watching and going to the cinema or something like that, like, my preference is to sit down in this activity, which is a little bit more sit forward, because I'm a more of a competitive person, so I prefer the sit forward multiplayer games, and that's what I like to do every night. And then from that, you know, from that point, then you can take it to the more like, okay, like, you know, yeah, there are some tangible things that I've learned from this. Like, my time with Counter-Strike did teach me a lot about teamwork, communication, organization, dedication, tactics for sure, problem solving, running a business. Like, you know, we're back in my Counter-Strike team, like, I had to run the server, and I had to run the website and the IRC channel, and we had stakeholders, you know, we had sponsors. So there was all of that side of it. But yeah, I mean, if you're really trying to position gaming as like a morally virtuous thing, then yeah, you can bring up the healing category of games, where it's like, yeah, there are games out there that are designed to be so immersive that burn victims can cut down on their addictive medication by 50%, which is a real boon, because you know, my cousin was a burn victim, and my experience as I visited him in the hospital was that he would get addicted to the painkillers quickly, and they had to keep on cycling them. And every time he would, you know, every week or so, or maybe every 4 days or so, they would cycle him onto a different, really strong painkiller. And it didn't kill all of the pain, because burn pain is like a special kind of pain, where your nerve endings are just like fried. But you do need the painkillers. And so, but you don't want to get too addicted to it. So they were cycling in between like 3 different ones. And every time they would cycle, it was like this excruciating thing. So, you know, it's a big deal to be able to say that you can cut down on someone's medication by 50% just purely by audio visual stimuli. Like, that's pretty amazing. And then, yeah, you know, I'm also quite impressed by, you know, certain political games and educational games and stuff like that. I think the science of compulsion, which we learned from the gambling industry, it's a tool that can be used for good or evil. A lot of the time it's used for evil, like in the gaming space with the gacha games and the loot boxes. Those are examples of it being used for evil. But if you take that tool and you put it in the category of educational game, and you're using that compulsion to get people to do positive things, then you're using it for good rather than evil. So yeah, you know, it's an answer that ranges all the way from it's just fun and it's what I prefer to do, all the way to like, yeah, there are genuine, tangible benefits to all of this.
Whenever I think about the positive things that games have done for me over the years, I just think of the great experiences and the great stories and characters that I have viewed in the same way that I would get that from a book or a movie. But what I really think about is the year 2011, Skyrim, Dark Souls, Portal 2. What a year for
Amazing.
gaming. But that's, if my maths is correct, that was over a decade ago. And from my perspective, not that I haven't stepped away from games a little bit over the last couple of years, there hasn't really been that big of a year for games. When I think of franchises like Elder Scrolls, Final Fantasy, which I haven't played, Call of Duty, Mario, Zelda, all of these fantastic games, these fantastic franchises that have provided so much joy and so many experiences to so many people. You've got Dark Souls in the back there, so you're very welcome to bring that up specifically. But what exactly makes a game or a game franchise so legendary and so capable of sticking with people over the years?
Well, you've gone and done it. You've gone and done it now, Cody. Because if you give me an opening to talk about Dark Souls,
I'm here for that.
My friends will tell you that I will take that opening and run with it. It's a bit of a in joke with everyone that at Fandom that I worked with. It's kind of an in joke that I'll talk about everything as like the Dark Souls of something else. I think Dark Souls is actually a great example of it, because like if you're talking about greatness, like people talk about Ocarina of Time as the greatest game ever made. And there's a semi consensus on that. Like a surprising amount of people agree. When they talk about like what's the greatest game ever made. Like I would expect, that question to have such a fractured response that, barely like 1% would be like the maximum of, like everyone would be talking about a different game. Everyone talking about their favorite game. But a surprising number of people talk about Ocarina of Time as it. And I think the reason for that is because of the ideas it gave to gaming and the other games that came afterwards that built on it. So Ocarina of Time gave so much to gaming, and that this was a period of time when gaming was moving from 2D to 3D. Certainly there were 3D games before it. There were even 3D games before Mario on the 64, but Mario and Zelda did it so right that they became like exemplars for how to do, and they did it like first go. It's like they didn't even need to play around first and screw up. It's like, no, here's Mario and it's freaking perfect, and here's Zelda and it's freaking perfect, and this is how we're going to do 3D now in gaming. And so Zelda pioneered things like context sensitive controls. It didn't need a jump button. Like when you walk next to the horse, the button changes to get on the horse. It had like a targeting system, the Z targeting system, which was very new for its time. It had the hub world, which was kind of like an open world, but it had these great design lessons, like having the giant mountain and the giant tower on the horizon as a signal of where to go, which of course has been copied by so many games since, like in Half-Life, you're talking about like City 17 and stuff like that. Any game with like a large citadel right at the start as like a pointer of where to go. I wrote a whole article about this for Ocarina of Time's anniversary, where there's just like so much it gave, and any game that came after it that used similar things had to be thought of as like somewhat copying Ocarina of Time. The way it would use its different music themes and its sword combat and stuff like that. So I think Dark Souls did a similar thing in that people hold Dark Souls in a similar spot of greatness because it gave modern gaming. To me, it's like the modern Ocarina of Time, like of our generation. It's like a darker, more Japanese horror kind of like Ocarina of Time, where it gave us so much, and so many games since have copied different elements of it. It doesn't matter if it's just a third-person combat game. You could be talking about a racing game. Like when Dark Souls' multiplayer is so like the world invasion system, drop in, drop out, has been copied by racing games. And its stamina-based reactive combat system has been adopted by games like God of War and other games, because I think developers, they play it and they're inspired by it, but they also just recognize that it's just a better system. Like, this is a more interesting game to play. It's a more interesting combat system if you have to memorize these cues and react to them, as opposed to just charging in and button mashing. I think it's a similar lesson that a lot of FPS games learned, when the Call of Duties and the Battlefields and other FPS games, like they eventually came around to Counter-Strike's system of a static recoil pattern, for bullets, like, because that's just more interesting than a random pattern of bullet spray. Like it gives you a higher skill ceiling when you have the ability to memorize the spray pattern and adjust your mouse movement accordingly, so that even though you're holding the trigger down, you're effectively firing in the same spot. I think, like, that's something that Counter-Strike gave to the world of FPS, and that puts it on a pedestal of greatness. Another major thing that Dark Souls gave was the understated storytelling. So many games, and I still think that, if you want a linear traditional story, if you want that style of storytelling, I still think a book is better. I still think a movie is better. I think if you're talking about the high bar in terms of traditional linear story, even though it's not very linear, but traditional storytelling in video games, I think Witcher 3 sets a really high bar. But like a lot of games can't meet that bar. I think Dark Souls' understated storytelling, where it's more about discovery, fits the medium of video games a lot better. And that style of storytelling where you have to like figure it out with the community, it's there if you want it, but it's also not there if you don't want it. So it's not obtrusive. It's like you have to be looking for it. And then all of a sudden there is a story. The story is told through level design. Why do these statues have chains around them? What's the story behind that? It's told through item descriptions, giving you a sneak peek into what another past character might have been thinking. It's told through the actions of NPCs, not just their words, because the dialogue in Dark Souls games is incredibly rare. Like, there's, compared to other games, there's very little cutscenes, very little dialogue. So I think, the reason I'm gushing about all this is because we're talking about what makes a game great. And I think those are elements that Dark Souls gave to gaming. And they were copied by numerous games afterwards. Understated storytelling, the stamina-based, reaction-based combat system, the style of multiplayer, drop-in, drop-out, world invasion. I think you have to do something like that if you want to be considered great. You can't just do everything super, super well, but not do anything new, right? I mean, like you'll still be known as a great game, but if we're talking about like what puts you in the halls of greatness, of like, best games ever made, I think you almost have to do something like that, something new. You go back all the way to Doom and Quake, and you're like, they're going to be forever remembered because they did that first, and they did it well. Mm-hmm. They did that perspective, and also on top of that, like all the level design was really great and stuff like that, and great tech.
Even when the original isn't the best, it sort of becomes the best because you have to appreciate it as being the father of everything else that came afterwards. So it wins by default.
Absolutely. Like, we're sitting here talking about Dark Souls, but Dark Souls 3 is a more polished version of the formula. Like it's better in almost every way.
Except the level design.
Oh yeah, you're right about that. Yeah. The Dark Souls connected world of the original, that was truly unique and special. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I still remember when I looked online, because no one else can really get here without knowing where to go. When you get to Ash Lake, where you go down to Blighttown, down to the disgusting sewer place, then into a tree, down the tree, and then you end up at a beach. And I was like, oh my God, how did I get here? What's going on? But
and there's not a lot. There's not a lot to it after that. Like I love the audacity that they have to just have an area like that where there's like, that's the end. And it's kind of a dead end path.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter. It's like so interesting to explore. And, I think, I talked to some of my game design friends about this where, on the subject of like what makes a game great and what puts it in the halls of greatness, like some of these games, they break game design rules to do this. Like Dark Souls broke so many rules. If you take like a game design like textbook or something, and I had like some of my friends who teach game design, they had so many gripes about Dark Souls. And they were saying like, oh, it breaks this design rule and it breaks that design rule. It doesn't have a pause button, and it has these dead ends in the exploration and blah blah blah. But then all of a sudden there's a moment where it clicks and they get it, and then they're the biggest fan of Dark Souls. And it's the same with other games like Counter-Strike and some of the MOBA games like League of Legends and Dota. Like I think Counter-Strike came at a time where it broke a major game design rule, which is it made you wait when you die. And like on paper, on the surface of it, that's a majorly frustrating thing. It's like, what, I die and I have to wait like a minute. Like, whereas all these other games like Quake and stuff, I'm just like back in the action straight away. But it's allowed to break those rules because it gives you something special and something unique that other games don't give. Like in Counter-Strike, it's like, along with that, you also have some situations where you're the last one left and everyone else is dead. And that means all eyes are on you. And you're in your own little personal James Bond show where you're trying to clutch it out 1v3 and get the bomb defusal. And that's special. Like no other game gives you that. So yeah, it's, it's funny. Like in a way, you almost have to like break those rules, those established wisdoms.
Because we talked about Dark Souls, I have to ask you the Dark Souls question. What is your favorite Dark Souls boss from any of the games?
Ooh, good question. Good question. This is going to seem like a cheap answer, but I have a soft spot for the bosses that commit so much to lore that they don't even have a proper boss fight. And so the one that I have in my head, and there are a few examples of this, and not just in Dark Souls, but other games have it as well. But I think the number one I have in my head is Maiden Estrella from Demon Souls, who is not even really a boss fight. You just go up and kill her. But the lore is incredible. And I think in terms of lore, Demon Souls is probably the strongest out of all the Souls games. But she has a protector. She has her knight who's by her side, and he tries to protect her, but she herself is a pacifist, and she's all about love, and she has so much empathy and love for everyone around her that she even loves these little plague babies that she's surrounded by. I probably shouldn't spoil too much because they've got the Demon Souls, the new version of Demon Souls that you can play on the PlayStation 5. So I highly recommend that people do that. But if I guess if I were to go with like a real one, that's like a real boss fight. I mean, there's so many examples of like well-designed fights in terms of the mechanics and dynamics. I like a lot of them from Elden Ring. But I might go the old monk from Demon Souls because it brought in this idea of a covenant between like boss and player, where for those who don't know, like the old monk in Demon Souls was the first boss that summoned real players to be the boss's minion and then fight against the player who was taking on the boss. So anyone who played Dark Souls 2 will remember that as the Looking Glass Knight. How like, he slams down his shield and then a real player will burst through his shield and then start fighting the player who's trying to take on the boss. And that's really cool. I love that. I love that as an idea, and it's also a really well-designed fight. But the one that did it first was the old monk in Demon Souls. And then, obviously later on after you've beaten the old monk, then you can be one of those players that he summons to help him in the fight. So also just a really well-designed fight mechanics wise, but yeah, for the idea and for like executing on the idea, yeah, I might go with that one.
Right. I think that the gaping dragon looks cool. Next question.
Yeah.
You were talking about Ocarina of Time, and when I think of that game, I think of the fact that even though I played it for the first time when I was like 20, it was never a nostalgic childhood thing for me. But even I can tell that I don't want to be hyperbolic when I say this, but I would say that there is at least one person in the world where that game has literally saved their life. And I'm sure that when they stumble upon the music or concept art and they listen to it or they see it, they have to just take a moment to relish the moment and realize how much that game has affected them and how much it helped them. For you, is there anything like that for you, where if you hear the music, if you go searching for it, if it just shows up in your life, you just have to still yourself and remember how important it was?
Yeah, I guess there's a few. I mean, I've played so many games, and there's been a few that have had such a large impact. I mean, the Ocarina of Time, the music was so great in that. that, you know, just hearing those tunes brings you back to, you know, Saria's song in the forest and stuff, Temple of Time. Like you, as soon as you hear it, you visualize it. So that's definitely in that category. Another one that comes to mind is Portal 2. Yeah, Portal 2. It was the second one because I remember the developers were talking about how they were modeling GLaDOS off of a jealous ex-girlfriend. And that's the kind of like tone that they wanted in her voice acting and in her writing of her dialogue. And so that also played into the song that they had at the end of both of the Portals. You know, the first one, which was so popular, but then the second one was a bit more like, it felt more like a breakup song. It was less quotable, like less people were like, you know, singing it at LAN parties and stuff. But the lyrics go something like, "Now I only want you gone." And I was going through quite a rough breakup at the time. And so, you know, I didn't even expect that. Like I knew they were probably going to do a song at the end of the game. But I didn't expect it to be like such a breakup song and like, and for it to resonate so much. So yeah, that one had like an emotional impact on me. I think I cried. I beat Portal 2 and then I cried. What else? In terms of music, you know, when I hear the it's the Firelink Shrine theme from Dark Souls.
Pretty.
I forget the name for it, the exact name. But that really just takes you back to a mood of like, you know, even the track itself just really captures that mood of like sitting around a bonfire with a couple of other people. You're about to go on your adventure, they're about to go on theirs, but you have this moment of rest where you can talk and use your Estus flask, and yeah, and it's because like it was a hub for so many adventures in Dark Souls. Like you rest at the Firelink Shrine before you go into the Undead Burg, and then you also rest at the Firelink Shrine. Like you open up a few shortcuts and you come back to it, and then later on before you go into the catacombs, and you talk to the big serpent dude. Like it all just keeps coming back to it, and then you keep on hearing that theme. So that's another one that comes to mind. Yeah, but I'm sure there's several examples. Probably some from Call of Duty, Call of Duty 4. Yeah, sound effects can do it almost as much as music can, you know, like I'm sure there's some from World of Warcraft that would really get me.
I'm sure as a fighting game enthusiast, certain shouts from certain characters just get you.
Yeah, you know, I love fighting games. It's a weird one. I've never been really good at fighting games, but I've played so much of them. But yeah, like old sound effects from Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, Dead or Alive. I played a lot of Dead or Alive. A lot of Marvel vs. Capcom. Oh yeah, the theme song to Marvel vs. Capcom. That would probably do it for me. Like if I heard that out and about, I'd have to go, oh yeah, remember that.
So excluding Ocarina of Time, in your personal opinion, what is the greatest game of all time?
Excluding Ocarina. Ooh,
I mean, you can say if you would include it if I gave you permission, but excluding that.
Yeah, yeah, with the caveat that I would choose that if I was allowed. Then I'd probably instead go with, you know, for me it'd be a tough call between Half-Life and Dark Souls. Yeah. Yeah, and again, Half-Life doing so much new and giving so much to games, and Half-Life 2 as well. Like, but oh, I think I'll go Dark Souls over Half-Life. Yeah, and I do my best to make objective arguments for Dark Souls. But you know, with the amount that I gush over Dark Souls, I think people just view me as incredibly biased at this point. They just go, "Ah, Jeremy, you like you just love Dark Souls." Like,
Yeah,
it's true.
I love it too, and that's including the fact that when I first started playing Dark Souls, when I got to Firelink Shrine, I went to the catacombs first with all the skeletons, which is like a little like much harder than the other places. I was like, this game really is hard, and
Yeah.
I remember losing to Sif, the big dog with the sword, literally
Mhm.
about 30 times, and just thinking this must be some sort of trick. This game is a prank played on the players. It's like so unfair and difficult. They're trying to test you. So I hated it for a long time, and then I just really got into it, as I'm sure maybe most players did.
Yeah, yeah. We all had that moment. You know, for me, I think there were people on the Good Game forum who were telling me about Demon Souls, and you know, there's some old advertising adage where it's like people have to hear something 7 times before they internalize it. And I think that number's actually grown now. I think it's more like 11 now. And I had a bit of a moment like that on the Good Game forums where, like, you know, you obviously can't play every game that people recommend or ask you to review. And back at that point, I don't think Demon Souls had an official Western release. It was still a Japanese game that people had to import, and people were petitioning Bandai Namco to bring it to the West. But eventually, when they did bring out a Western version, so many people had recommended it on the Good Game forums that I just had to give it a go. And yeah, it was funny. My partner at the time was watching me just fail and fail and fail. But and I looked aside and asked her, like, do you find this boring? Like, this is incredibly boring for you? And she goes, no, I like seeing you try different tactics every time and trying something new. And I was like, wow, okay, that's being so generous. Because to me, I'm just like dying over and over again. But yeah, you know, it didn't take too long for it to click. I think the gameplay clicked quicker than the lore clicked. It was only later that I realized there was this incredibly deep lore to it all. But yeah, some of those boss fights, some of those early ones, so amazing. The way they designed their castles, so amazing. And then the phalanx and the tower knight. And I think they just keep on revisiting these ideas. Like, you know, was it the Chosen One or something like that from Bloodborne is basically like a redesigned tower knight fight, where it's like you have the main boss in the middle, but you have all these crossbowmen, or in Bloodborne, they weren't crossbowmen, but they're ranged units up all on the ramparts. It's pretty much the same fight, but they keep on refining the formula and coming back to those ideas and doing better versions of it.
And now that I think about it, the phalanx from Demon Souls is a lot like the Royal Rat Vanguard from Dark Souls 2, as in there's just a bunch of stuff in a room, and you have to get the one, you got to get the heart of the swarm.
Yeah, and then you do all your crazy attempts and you finally beat it, and then you go up on YouTube and then you look up what the speedrunners are doing, and then they beat it in like 10 seconds. And you're like, oh, you bastards.
Well, that brings us to the last question that I always ask at the end of this, which is, of course, why are stories important?
Why are stories important? So there's this idea that from an evolutionary perspective, that you know, those who told stories had an advantage over those who didn't. And so the idea goes, you know, if you were sitting around a campfire listening to your elder describing which berries were safe to eat and which were poisoned, you would have an advantage, and evolution would select for you. And I think partially because of that, and partially because of other evolutionary mechanisms, all fun in some way or another is learning. And so stories, which we find entertaining, they're learning. And the same can be said about other kinds of fun and other kinds of entertainment, you know, whether we're learning about you know, social dynamics, or whether we're learning about other more physical things. all fun is kind of learning, and that to us is storytelling is like a relic of our evolution, or of our prehistoric selves, which you know, the utility hasn't escaped us completely. Like, obviously modern life is very different. We don't really want for anything. We can have drinkable water any second of the day that we want. We eat, if anything, too much food. We have to figure out ways uh, to implement more struggle, fake struggle, into our lives. We have to go and lift weights that don't need to be lifted. We have to run when we don't have anywhere to be. You know, we do these things to implement more struggle into our lives. But I think still the benefit of storytelling hasn't left. So there's still, it might not be, you know, so much from an evolutionary perspective now, but we still learn from it. It's still our brains telling ourselves that it's fun to hear this story because there could be value in it, because there could be utility. I think that's what's happening deep in there in the reward centers. You know, some stories are obviously created better than others. Not all stories are created equal. But there's value, there's learning to be had, and there are advantages to be had with most stories.
Jeremy Junglist Ray, truly, thank you so much for coming on to One Story Building.
No worries. Thanks for having me.